Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. We're going to wait a minute as the room fills. We've got to let everybody enter, but I'm excited to have you here tonight, covering a topic that is near and dear, standardized testing. And we just had a new information dropped yesterday, which is never dull, or actually it was 2 days ago, in terms of changes coming to the ACT. So when there are changes, as Peter just mentioned to me before our session, things get more interesting, more exciting. So we'll wait another 20 seconds. I see the number still ticking up a little bit. And then one thing to know, we always are going to share a recording. So know that that's coming within a couple days, typically. And hopefully we'll answer a lot of your questions tonight. And there will definitely be time for Q&A at the end. I will save time. And so I hope to answer a bunch of questions of yours before then. But at the end, we'll make sure we wrap it up and cover everything we didn't cover. Rock and roll. All right, let us begin. So globally, even with the changes that are coming in the spring, the structure of the two tests is going to be the same. They overlap about 80%. These tests are very similar. And even more so, if after the ACT drops science or makes it optional, potentially in the spring or beyond, then these tests will even more. It's just verbal and math. And science will become a thing that you take if you want to take it. And if you don't, you don't. And I suspect that a lot of kids will not take science. Just my instinct to have a 2-hour test versus, a 3-hour test. So the SAT is more rigorous on reading comprehension. It's about 2 grade levels higher. Okay, so we're looking at like 11th grade and above versus like 9th grade reading level. So you have more advanced passages. You have the Charlotte Bronte, you'll have Shakespeare. You'll have definitely tougher reading on the SAT. The ACT, you have a standalone science section for now, and you have more advanced math. So that is how it differentiates itself from the SAT. So the current structure, tests are very similar. Right now we have a reading and writing section. They're, well, similar in certain aspects, different. We'll talk about the fact that the SAT is an adaptive test and the ACT is not. And also, the science is distinct. But you have the reading and writing, which is the grammar, reading comprehension, all collapsed together. Your intro section on the ST, then you have your adaptive, 10-minute break, come back in, you have your baseline math, mostly algebra, algebra 2, very light stats and other things, and then you have your advanced module. The ACT is 4 discrete modules, big block for reading, big block for English, take a break, the verbal's done for the morning, come back in, you have an hour for math, you have 35 minutes for science, and then you're done. Some kids, they give them an experimental section at the end, 20 minutes, but not every kid. It depends if they're doing pre-testing at that testing site. All right, now we just got news on Monday evening that there's a shorter test coming. There was a pilot in June, and the pilot looks like it's going to be the same structure. It has the same number of items, and so we think this may be actually how it plays out. So in the pilot, the time for testing drops from 255 down to 2 hours and 5 minutes. So it's actually going to be shorter than the SAT, which is a real, a win for kids who get mentally fatigued from a long test. You have reading, then English, then you have your math. And then if you want to, you take science. And they're actually giving kids more time for science. And they're giving kids more time per question, which is one thing pretty profound, that the ACT has always been a speedy test, but it's about to become less speedy. They're giving kids more time. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a deeper dive right now into the SAT, into the adaptive nature of it, and then we'll go deeper into the forthcoming ACT. So bear with me while we talk about this. But for some of you, it's brand new. So again, it's adaptive by section, which means you have your baseline module, and then you go either easier or harder based on performance. If you get it roughly 2/3 right, you're going to go harder. Below 2/3 right, you go easier. That's a simple way to frame it. Now, you do have more time per question. The SAT really is very generous with timing. And so, looking at the verbal section, currently the way it's structured, you have 60% more time on verbal and almost the same for math. So the SAT is giving you a lot more time per question. But if you go to the advanced modules, some of our kids need that extra time because the content does get harder. However, when it comes to the pilot, it looks like things are getting very close for verbal. Look at that distinction. It goes from 71 seconds per question for the combined reading and writing. Then you only have 3 seconds left. Lower for the ACT. That's huge. So essentially you're on par. But math, there's still a timing advantage, but it's not as big. It was 59%, now it's 43%. So you still have more time per question on the SAT math, but a lot of kids, again, they're going to need it for some of the multi-level problems that are showing up now on the digital SAT. All right, so number of items. This again is changing, but there are currently only 98 little items on the SAT compared to 215 on the current ACT. So the ACT has a lot more items because it's not adaptive and it's just a longer test. And here, the same thing for verbal. When you add up the reading and the English, you have only 54 questions on the SAT versus 115 on the ACT. So that just shows you how different they are. However, again, the new ACT is going to look different. We're going to have 54 questions on the SAT compared to only 86. And then total items, it goes from 98 total items on the digital SAT compared to only 131 if you lop off science. So these tests they're converging again. The SAT had a real advantage that it was shorter, fewer items, more time per question. But with this recent announcement, the ACT is making a move to catch up with its with a partner, the duopoly, with the College Board. So in terms of content and structure, you have a lot more algebra on the SAT, and that should remain. And then you have more trig and geometry on the ACT, and they both have some analysis, looking at charts and graphs, a little bit of light stats, looking at some scattergrams or some plots. But a lot more algebra 1 and 2 on the SAT. That's one major distinction. And the ACT will always have harder content. There'll be more conic sections like ellipses, parabolas. You're going to have matrix multiplication. Like every few tests, they'll show up. You have domains and ranges of functions, asymptotes, and things like that. So these are concepts which do not show up on the current SAT, which is really a lot of algebra, a lot of function notation, a lot of graphing, intersections, a lot of exponents, that kind of thing. So different tests in terms of math. And now the SAT, it has short passages, under 150 words. Although I took the practice test 6, and they are introducing some more comparison. So they actually give you 2 short paragraphs, but still it's nothing remotely like what it used to be for the the long form passages. So that is coming. And right now, the current long form, you have 10 questions for these big 500 plus word passages. And so that also will probably be changing some. We'll learn more. All we have is the announcement from Monday. The formats, you have, again, reading and writing. You have an hour and 4 minutes for those 2 modules, then a break. Then you have an hour, 10 minutes for math, and then you are done. There are going to be a couple of these pre-test questions, which are experimental, and those don't count. You have 2 per section, so there are 4 sections. Both two verbal, 2 math, which means there are 8 questions which don't count towards your score. That's helping them pre-test questions for a future test, make sure there's no bias, make sure things are calibrated properly with levels of difficulty. So adaptive testing, I want to make sure you're clear on this one, that it is not item adaptive where every item is changing as you're taking it. It is section adaptive. You take a whole section, you can go back and forth, change your answers. When time's up, and calculate your score. If you get more than 2/3 right, you go harder. Less than 2/3 right, you go easier. That's it. And so that's how this thing works. They don't tell you if you're in the easy or hard module, and even on your score return, they don't tell you on the back as well. You don't know. So the name of the game is don't sweat it, don't worry about it, just keep focusing. But if you start getting to some really challenging content, you probably went to the hard section. All right. The administration is on the Blue Book app, which students bring their own device, which is fabulous. And you open up the Blue Book application and it locks everything else down. You can't go on the internet, you can't search around. And you preload the test a couple days before. And so when you go in there, it's encrypted. They give you the code and then the test is unencrypted. That's very nice. So there's a timer in the middle. The proctor is there to monitor things, but honestly, your test doesn't start till you press start. So if you go to the bathroom, come back, and you press start a little bit late, it's, you're on your own timing. You always have a calculator built in, and you do have three pieces of scratch paper. You can raise your hand and get more if you need it. And if you have any combinations, they're going to be preloaded onto the Blue Book app. You open your thing, and whatever combinations you've secured with the SSD, the coordinator, they're baked into the test. So again, you're much less reliant upon the proctor for anything. They don't call time. They don't collect books. They don't give out books. You walk in there with your device. You press start. When you press, we can start your tests. It's really easier on the proctors. And the proctors we talk to, they prefer this new test quite a bit. There's no matching up scantrons and testing booklets and so forth. Now, the reading and writing section, it's very predictable. It goes in this very orderly fashion through these questions. You're going to have, 4, 5, 6 craft and structure questions. That's words and context. That's the vocab questions, looking across text connections. Then info and then it goes easy to hard. Then you back to easy. Info and ideas, evidence, inference, easy to hard. Then you're back to grammar, form, structure, sense, and then expression of ideas. A lot of transitions between sentences and rhetorical synthesis, where they give you these bullet points and you're asking for the main ideas. So that's really how it goes. It goes easy to hard, each one of these, and then all the way through. It's kind of like this wave pattern. It's lovely that you have this tracking feature at the bottom. You hover over this review thing, and then boom, it tells you where you are in the test. It tells you anything you flag when you flag it. It tells you any ones you didn't answer, and you can go through them very quickly. And a lot of kids do use the mark for review, and they toggle between questions at the end if they have a few minutes left. So that's pretty handy. Here's an example of the words in context. We're just, frustrated with the blank. So you're frustrated with something that's, something that's not positive. The author coined this thing. And so with the variety, the limitations, the precision, you're frustrated with the, the limitations, a negative thing. Okay. All right. Next, you go to the inference questions. And again, there are science ones, and these are just one quick hitters, like 100 words on science. The next question, boom, it's going to be on human geography. Then it could be a poem. And so it's like TikTok. They come and there's no long form stuff. Polyurethanes are commonplace, yada, yada, yada. So go through all the science stuff. Which choice completes the text, and you go from there and you answer the best one. The math section, you have an easy and hard questions in the first module, and both modules go easy to hard questions, but you end up with a lot more hard if you go to the hard module. And then multiple choice, so there are going to be some student response in there. And you always have your Desmos calculator. You hover over it, the calculator, and it opens right up. Right there. So if I click calculator, boom, Desmos opens, and I can move it around where I want it. And Desmos is very powerful. Anyone taking the SAT has to practice on Desmos, because you don't want to be learning it as you're going. But it's over half the kids in the country use Desmos. It's in some form for their physics or their math. It's a very common academic calculator, and this it's not surprising they did a deal with them for licensing the calculator. You also can pull up your reference. The circle, area equals pi r squared, circumference equals 2 pi r. That all lives there. The basic right triangles and the 3, 4, 5 and so forth. That's all right there on the reference section. So Desmos pops up, and the new math is much less reading heavy. The 2016 to 2023 SAT had a lot more reading on the math section, but the new math is much less reading, more pure math, fewer words and fewer math in context, less about reading the science or stuff and doing the math. Here, it's more just here's the math, solid. All right, Desmos, practice. You can practice on desmos.com. It's important. Is to show you a few examples. The question here is solve for y. So system of equations, I could isolate, I could eliminate x, or with Desmos, I just type in and the 6x equals 10, y equals 60, then this, and then I'm trying to find the value of y. Well, you look at the intersection, that's the solution set, and the x is 5 and the y is 3. The answer is 3. Bingo. So Desmos, in many cases, is faster than doing the algebra. And here is the quad formula. Y equals 2x squared plus x minus 21. The function has zeros at a and b. What's the distance between the two zeros? Again, I could do distance formula and things like that, the quadratic formula, or I can plug this in to the graph, and then boom, that distance is 6.5. So I could do the algebra, I could have the formula memorized, or I just use my Desmos calculator. That's very simple. All right. Now, in terms of the easier and harder adaptive modules, they're very different. And, there was a real surprise. Some of you may have heard that back in March, there were kids who were shocked at how hard the math module was. And we learned, yeah, there are going to be some challenging items on math. So, and we've seen that played out now of March, then May, and then June. So now we know it wasn't an anomaly. This math is hard for the harder module. And so you have to get about 2/3 right to go to the hard section. Let me just give you a sense of what it looks like. And this is test 1 on the Blue Book app, and I should probably do test 6. I'm going to give you a better sample. But test 1 on the intro module, the baseline module that everyone gets, similar module, you're going to have only 2 level 1 questions, very easy. You're going to have 10 level 2. So then you're going to have 7 level 3, getting harder, and 3 level 4, the really hard stuff. So you see that the baseline section swells toward the middle. The majority of your questions, 17 of them of 22, live in that middle range, okay? If I don't do as well, then I get here. Under 2/3 right, they throw me an easier module. So now I have 7 level 1s. I have 9 level 2s. Then I only have down to 5 level 3s and only 1 level 4. If, however, I get 2/3 right on my baseline, I go to the hard module, which looks like this. And this actually is for test 1, which isn't hard enough. But level 1s, I don't have 7, I only have 1 level 1, because the assumption is I'm not going to miss those. Those are lost on me. Level 2 questions go from 9 down to 4. But then boom, I have 12 level 3 and I have 5 level 4. So I really skew to the right. And the so that's so you understand how adaptive testing works. And that's one of the ways we can get to a short test by not asking lower level kids the really hard questions which they're going to miss, and not asking the really advanced kids the lower level questions. So we get efficiency by doing this section adaptive. That's how we get down to a short test. There's also a thing which is not maybe for your own interest, to understand why they don't get back the same level of detail. There's something at play here called item response scoring. And what that is that when on this test, different items have different weights. Question 6 could weigh twice as much as question 8. And some questions are more foundational questions, some are a little less important. And so that also is a factor in terms of advancing to the harder modules, which questions you get right and wrong, and also your final score. And so it's a little more confusing. It used to be everything counts the same, but not anymore now. This is a really important question. If you miss it, it counts off more. All right. And there also are, there are many test forms. The SAT College Board said every single student has a highly comparable but unique test. And what that means is they're going to shake up a number of things. And this is one of the ways that it's much more secure. My number 3 could be your number 6, within a certain range, or, it's going easy to hard, but still there's some wiggle in terms of where it lives. On that same question, my answer is A, your answer is D. So the answer is bouncing around. Also, there's something we learned that the numbers also change. I have a 3, 4, 5 triangle, and you could have a 9, 12, 15 triangle. So my answer is, let's say 3 pi, and yours is 6 pi, whatever it is. And so that's one thing why tests are more secure. Very handy. So the way you prep for this thing, you go to the Blue Book. There are 6 practice tests. Test 1 and 2 are too easy on the math section. Be mindful of that. So don't calibrate your baseline from that first test. And you can practice on Desmos. You can work through it there. But those tests are calibrated. We definitely find that tests 4, 5, and 6 are really as hard as what we're seeing in the field on the March, May, and June test for the math especially. When they give you back your scores, this is what you get, these heat maps, which do not have the level of detail that we used to get. They don't tell you missed number 6. They don't tell you put B, the answer was D. All you get back is this. They don't give you back your scores anymore. I mean, your actual questions, there's no question return service. On your PSAT, you don't get back your PSAT booklet. This is what you get. And that's one of the reasons we think it's critical that students take practice tests with companies like ours, where we actually give you back the full detail and tell you what you missed, why you missed it. There is more detail on the Blue Book apps on the practice test. They give you missed 6, you missed 7, you missed 12. But it's on the actual tests, March, May, and June, they give you back this, and that's all you get. Now accommodations, again, they're baked in. If you have extra breaks, extra time, you're not dependent upon the proctor to call anything. It's all happening on your application, on the Blue Book app. That's very nifty. All right, and let me pass that one through. So I also mentioned that when it comes to March, and then also May and June, that it turns out, it went from more level 3s to we think there are more level 4s on the March test. So the actual tests being administered now look more like this, where math really gets a lot harder in the advanced module. So be mindful of that. All right, students and admins like the new test. They like that it's shorter. They like that it's not so fatiguing. It's a couple hours. You can start at 8:30, you're done. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes is the whole thing. Once you get past the gridding and your name and so forth. So, and actually there's no gridding, there's no more Scantron, but it's just entering the codes and so forth. So short passages, more time per question. You always have your calculator, and results, or they promise eventually we'll get results back in a few days. Right now it's about, it's like a couple weeks. Very good. Now the ACT, we learned Monday, it's changing. And they're going to keep offering their digital non-adaptive tests, which they have been doing. They forced international kids on the digital test in 2019. So we're on year 5 of the ACT doing digital testing. It's not new at all. It's been around for a long time. And they were piloting tests way before that. But they forced every person in Mexico and Canada and Europe to take a test. They got rid of paper 5 years ago. So, and they're going to be debuting the shorter, less speedy test in the spring, which we assumed is April, and science becomes an optional. And I think a lot of kids will not take science. Here are the structural changes. The current SAT is on top. Question 75, time for minutes, versus go down. The June pilot, the questions go down to 50. So we're knocking off a third of the questions. Very efficient, and 10 minutes. Math, we're knocking off a fourth of those questions and 10 minutes. Reading, we're only knocking down 4 questions and actually giving kids more time. Science, we're not knocking down any questions and giving kids 10 more minutes. So that's substantial. So we're making science less speedy. Everything is going to be less speedy. And so that's a big deal. And then here we have that analysis. So on the current ACT, English goes from 36 seconds per question. Now they're giving you an extra 6 questions. Math, they're giving you an extra 7 seconds. Reading, they're giving you 27% more time, which is meaningful. And science also almost 30% more time. So the test it's going to be better for kids, because speed has always been the most challenging thing. I've been saying this for over 20 years. You can't prep for this without having a stopwatch and a clock, because speed is a major factor on the ACT. But that's going to be less so going forward. So in science, you can opt in or opt out. Some STEM kids may want to showcase their science and get another thing, but honestly, the science section is not really pure science. Of the 40 questions, about 6-7 of them tests outside knowledge beyond the paragraphs. Otherwise, it's mostly reading skills. You're reading, you're looking at charts, tables, and graphs. So there is some graph fluency, but it's not AP Chem or physics or bio. And so I live in Atlanta, and Georgia Tech, for 10 years, they didn't even count the science section. So that tells you they want the math, because if you can't do math, you can't be an engineer. And they want the verbal, but they were light on science, because it really is not pure science. They'd rather look at your AP Chem or your IB Chem grade for that and so forth. All right, the rollout. This is the quote. Both of these exciting changes, along with other enhancements to modernize the test, are coming with national online testing in the spring of this year. So we're assuming it's April, and then it'll start in school-day testing next year. So they'll be using paper during school day tests until the spring of 2026. So students can still take it online or with paper and pencil. And then we just don't know how widely available it's going to be. There are some open questions here. Can you bring your own device? That made things much easier for the College Board. That would increase capacity dramatically. We don't, I don't think concordance should be an issue, according the SAT and the ACT, but we'll see if that plays out. Math, by getting rid of science, you have two verbal scores and a math score. Well, then the combined, actually, I'm changing that. The combined verbal outweighs the math. But science, is mostly verbal and graph reading. And then there are questions, will colleges accept the changes? Is it going to increase how competitive the ACT is? Because the ACT is a lot lower in market share. You have 1.9 million kids taking the SAT versus 1.3 and change taking the ACT. So it's a less popular test right now, but this could put them back in a top position. So we'll see. Timelines. We have 7 dates for the ACT, 7 dates for the SAT. We have summer testing. You have winter testing. So pretty much anytime during the year, a test is available for you. And there are different schedules for preparation. Some kids defer their prep till late in the year. That's okay. When they're juniors, they could take the February, April, June ACT. As some kids who are big athletes, they're recruited athletes, they save their testing for the summer. That's okay, or for the early fall. Depending, there are lots of ways to do it. Some kids, what they do a prep class in the summertime, let's say June, July. They go and lock in a test in August for the SAT, then come back and take it later in the spring and summer. Totally fine, as long as you refresh it and do some preparation before the actual tests that are coming up. All right. Now, Apple Ruth, we have 3 digital adaptive SAT tests, and we have in-depth analysis, and that can help you create a tailored plan for studying. So we're doing that. And now I'm actually going to pivot. Let me see. It's 8:28, and I think there are a few questions. Let me see if these are tied to testing. All right. And these 3 questions. We bought the new Apple Ruth book for the digital SAT. Are you issuing a new book for the new ACT? We are still waiting to get more details about this, because honestly, the questions aren't going to change. It's going to change the structure, so we might, create some practice tests, but the actual content is not going to shift. It's not a content change; it's a formatting change, and that's more for practice than strategy for question types. It's confirmed that the new ACT is coming out, is for sure. This was released by the president and CEO, Janet Godwin, on Monday, that it's coming this spring. So again, but they didn't promise how broad the rollout would be, and if kids are going to use their own device or not. And so that's something that's meaningful. Michael, is it possible for a level 1 student who aces module 2 to score higher than a level 2 student who tanks level 2? Yes, it is. So in terms of the score ranges, here's how this works. If I crush if I crush the first section, I'm guaranteed to get at least like a 440, 450. That's my floor. I can miss every single question, but I've already anchored in all the points from answering so many right on the first section. Then if I don't do as well, and I go to the module 2, the lower module, and I get every single thing right, I get all 22 questions right, then I'm going to get around a 650, 660. So here's the thing. If I get above a 660, let's say I get a 710, well, I know for sure I went to the hard module. If I get a 390, I know for sure I went to the easy module. But in between that 440, 450, and that 660, there's overlap. So a kid could do really, really, really well on the easier module and get a 650, and do terribly on the hard module and get a 470. So there is overlap in that range, if that makes sense. All right, Blue Book is the name of the app. If you Google right now, College Board Blue Book app, it'll pull up, and you can download it onto your computer, onto your Apple, or onto your Windows computer, and take a practice test. There are 6 available right now, and Blue Book is the application that kids use to practice and take the actual test. So there's no, are you wondering what's it like for students? The Blue Book app is the app. So, how you practice, so too do you take the actual test. And you can practice tonight if you want to see what they're working with. All right. If I take the test the first time, then I do worse. Second time, which grade will I take? Well, there's super scoring. And you know what? Let me answer some of these at the end. I think I'll answer some of these with my next slides. So now I'm talking kind of broadly about the landscape of testing, and then we'll go to specific questions at the end. There'll be time for that. So here we go. First, test optional. Let me talk about that. So we know that test optional is the most popular by leaps and bounds testing policy in the US. About 3/4 of colleges in the country are test optional. Now, test optional and test blind, they're very different things. We have learned that test optional testing can still factor in very heavily and still not be required. We learned that at some of the schools were very selective, and we learned like schools like Yale, like, they were admitting kids with test scores 3 times to 1 without test scores, which is they're an anomaly how extreme that is, but just telling you that you can be optional, but tests still factor in a lot. Testing is making a comeback at the schools that are selective. During the pandemic, the entire world was test optional because testing was impossible to get in certain markets. It's still pretty challenging in California and Washington for a number of reasons. But now Florida never dropped testing. The Georgia system went back to testing pretty quickly, and then Georgetown, MIT, Tennessee, Purdue. And in the last 8 months, we saw a flurry of the top schools in the country, Dartmouth and Yale and Brown, UT Austin, Harvard, Caltech, Cornell. Those all pop within a series of months. Oh, and I didn't put Stanford in there. That is my bad. Stanford hopped on the train also. And there are more coming. And we're going to see a lot more of that in the fall. So even if you're looking at a school that's very selective, and there's a decent chance things could swing back to test required for some of those schools. This list is not complete, and they're gonna so we'll see how that goes. My bad there. Cornell, Yale, Harvard, Caltech, MIT. Right, I gotta put Stanford back in there. Now the rationale is the research shows that we can't predict who will do well with grades alone. We need some testing. The test scores are actually a very good predictor of performance, better than high school grades. They're the single best predictor for Yale. High school GPA explains a lot less of performance in college than the testing does alone. And test admitters had higher grades. So, the kids who are admitted without test scores, they for UT, there are a lot of kids who are auto admits for UT with their placement in their classes. But then for the kids that they bring in, who are not auto admits, those who didn't have test scores had about almost a full grade below at midpoint freshman year, and they were much more likely to be on probation academically and have under a 2.0. So the test scores were protective for kids. They made sure the kids could do well. And that's why MIT, they're like, we bring kids in who have 4.0s and they fail out. Like, we need that 740 on math to know they can handle MIT. Having an A in calculus, there are very different grading cultures around the country. Some kids are graded for their attitude or their perseverance or their positivity, versus other schools, it's just the material. And so grading cultures versus on a test, it's just mastery. Do you know the material or not? Raj Chetty, future Nobel laureate, I'm sure, with his output, he's the big data monster. He analyzed 2 million students' outcomes, and his research at Harvard showed that test scores are better predictors of than grades. Here's the main graph, that as test scores go up, grades at these schools are linear increase. But look over here on the right side, that a kid with a 3.1 in high school does almost the same as a kid with a 4.0. So once they get there. So in the grand scheme, high school grades aren't giving you as much information about how you'll do in college, but test scores really tell you how you'll do in college in a much more meaningful way. And here was that UT Austin thing I mentioned. So I just gave a talk last weekend on grade inflation. There's been a lot of it in the country, a lot of A's. I gave a talk with one of the reps from Georgia Tech, and I was floored. If you're applying to Georgia Tech, 76% of kids they admit out of state don't have a single B on the transcript. It's all A's. And from Georgia, it's like 56%. So it's astounding how many kids have like perfect grades. So everyone's coming with these great GPAs, and that's one of the reasons Tech is test required, because to help distinguish kids from each other. Like the test scores are sometimes do often more than the grades because so many kids have strong grades these days. And testing is required by some publics. We're actually going to be reinstating a bunch of Georgia schools from Georgia State to Kennesaw. It was the two flagships, but now there are like 6 more schools entering, and that's going to be happening. I'm waiting for UNC Chapel Hill to come back. I'm waiting for, Southern California, USC to come back. There's going to be a bunch of schools coming in the fall and the spring. And, I think the Southern systems, there may be a strong return to testing across the South. We'll see. Texas is already in. I think Chapel Hill is coming, and they're going to maybe announce in the fall. And then there's schools like Auburn where it's conditional test optional. And I had a friend whose daughter was applying and she had like a 3.2. I'm like, it's test optional, but not for your kid. Because if you have a 3.59, tests are required. Over 3.6, they're optional. But if you have it, you probably still should send it. There are 80 schools in the country that are test blind and test free. Though I think I did remove, yeah, I got rid of Caltech, thank you. Because and some of them are going to change back too. There are schools going test blind to test required, which is a pretty dramatic flip, but Cornell did that, Caltech did that. So there'll be more of that coming. And part of it, the colleges are trying to tell you, like, submitting scores may help you. If you don't submit, we have less information. So it's optional, but we encourage the submission. That's giving you a sense. Additionally, there are schools who give you money for your test score. Alabama, I have to pull this up, but this is my niece applied from Virginia, and she had a 1390 SAT that put her in the UA Scholar. So tuition went from $32,000 out of state down to $8,000. So which is amazing. It's actually cheaper than in-state tuition because of that test score and a 3.5 GPA. So they're giving you money for your grades and your testing. And test optional and test blind are not the same thing. They can strengthen the application very strongly. And the question then becomes, when I have the choice, do I submit it or not submit it? Can it help me? Will it strengthen my application? That's the question. Do kids have an edge with test scores? At certain schools, yes. Boston College, they're very clear. They're letting kids in almost 3-to-1 with test scores versus without. You have 70,000 kids apply with tests, 20,000 without tests. They let in only 2,500 kids without tests, but 5,000 kids with tests. So the rates of acceptance are different. Why Boston College, they're optional, but the language now is like we encourage it. And then I mentioned Yale was letting kids in 3-to-1. You can see some of the ranges like Boston College Tech when they were optional for a year, there was still a big differential. Colgate 2-to-1, Notre Dame, Emory 2-to-1, UVA almost 2-to-1, Wellesley, and so forth. Then there are some schools like Vandy where the difference wasn't as extreme. So it depends on the culture of the school in terms of how they look at tests and so forth. And this difference, you have to understand, this is not entirely testing advantage. There's something called collinearity, or there's where things move together, where kids who send test scores have strong test scores. Kids who have strong test scores typically also have better grades. So there's something there they're moving together. It's not just the testing alone, but there definitely is an edge where 2 kids apply to Emory. One kid has a 34 ACT, one kid has no testing. That impacts the outcome and the conversation. So it does. I've heard that from one of my good friends, a colleague at Emory. So and then when schools do not give you this information, one thing you can look at is how many kids who are accepted, who are admitted, how many of them have test scores. And like Princeton, almost all of them, kids who are getting in, kids have test scores. Same thing with UNC, same thing with UVA, same thing with Chicago, same thing with Penn. And so test scores, if I see that the majority of kids going to schools have test scores, that tells me something about, even though they don't give you those differential numbers, that's one proxy for these things. And Jeremiah Quinlan, he was at Yale, said, we were letting kids with test scores 3 times the rate. I became more convinced that we were not being honest about the reality. So we stopped calling it test optional. And now it's, and students who weren't submitting were hurting their chances. So this was not part of their marketing when they were test optional for 3 years. But after they made the change, they came out and then they came clean. So should you send test scores in? Get your baseline scores in first. Take a practice SAT. Take a practice ACT. Am I close to a school that's optional? If it's required, there's no but if they're a freshman profile, the incoming freshman, they have between like their middle 50 is a 1350 to a 1450. If I have my baseline score is 1,000, I have a pretty big way to go. I'm going to go without testing. But if I have a 1,200, I'm in the game, I'm in the window, I can get to where they want that, where the score will be a strength. And so that's part of it, looking at their ranges. So do you want them to see it? So there are some differences also by major, because like one of the things where the reason MIT and Caltech and they're back to test required, they want that math score. If you're going to be an engineer, they want to know, can you do math? And getting a 750 on the ST on math tells them I have a certain ability in math. Or the same thing, getting a 5 on BC calculus or things like that. But a lot more kids applying to engineering or STEM programs or even business are having test scores sent. Gen Ed, other thing, liberal arts, a lot fewer kids are sending test scores. But if you're looking at a STEM program, having a math score that shows your math abilities can help you. Rick Clark, friend, colleague, says, you know what, if you're in the upper half, send your scores. If you're in the lower 50% time, it depends a little bit. If you're in the bottom quartile, I probably wouldn't send it unless there's something really exceptional, or, if you're a first generation student or you come from a really underrepresented area of the country, otherwise don't send. So here's an example, like Colorado Buffs. The middle 50 is an 1170 to a 1380. So if I get a 1330 or, I would for sure send it. If I get below an 1170, I probably wouldn't send it unless there's something really exceptional about my application. And then it becomes a question if I'm in the third quartile. If I have an 1170, let's say 1180, but I have really amazing grades and amazing rigor, I probably wouldn't send it because it's relatively weaker. It weakens my application. I'd rather stand on the merits of my rigor and my GPA. If, however, I have like a 700 in math in there and I have a 560 in verbal, but I'm applying to be an engineer, I want to showcase my math score. So I send it even though I'm in the third quartile. And that's part of the calculus too. Like what's, my major selection, what, my coherent narrative is if a math kid, show them a good math score and so forth. And then also be mindful that scores have increased. That's the reality on a test optional. You pretty much lop off the bottom quarter of kids who have low scores who don't send them, which means that testing ranges typically pop a little bit. And that's something that we're seeing, across the board. And so take a broader lens when considering submitting your score. Like Brown said, hey, median test scores have risen. And so the inflated scores may be intimidating. I probably look back a couple of years to before the pandemic to see what kind of test scores they accepted in 2020. And the way you do that, you type in 3 letters CDS, common data set. You type in like Georgetown common data set, UVA common, see where they were 4 years ago to get a sense, because scores have actually globally decreased since then across the country. So if they accepted, their middle 50 was an 1180 to a 1280, but now it's popped up, and I get somewhere in the middle of that, I still might send it because that used to be a competitive score for them. All right, so now we're going to open this thing up and take your questions. It is 8:44. We have 16 minutes. That's awesome. All right, so type in your questions. Whatever I didn't answer, load it in there. If I take the SAT and then I do worse next time, which grade will it take? Well, you choose what scores you send. The only exception, if I, no, actually, a score choice abounds. So you get this, I can withhold the score. I'm not going to send May. I'm going to send March, or I'm going to send March and June because I had a better verbal in June and better math. And they're going to combine them. It's called super scoring. Super scoring is they'll take my verbal from March and my math in June, and together that's the score they look at. That's called super scoring. And the majority of schools in the country super score the SAT, and many super score the ACT. How many times can I take it? Infinitely, if you want. It's 7 times a year. However, we find that after 3 times, kids are pretty much capped out. Occasionally, someone pops in the 4th, but some kids go down because they get fatigue. So ideally, your testing plan has 3 tests, and after Some kids are one and done, some are two and done, but we see gains on average through the third test. We see a nice pop from 1 to 2 and a smaller pop from 2 to 3. I heard students might be able to use Desmos to get correct answers for math questions that they can't do without a calculator. Is this for real? Well, if you have a TI can do most everything Desmos can do. But I think Desmos is super user-friendly. One thing that's great about Desmos is like the TIs, you have to put everything into the y equals mx plus b, but you don't have to with Desmos. It'll read anything you put into it. You type it in on your keyboard. So Desmos is super handy. Learn how to use it. We have a, part of our book, part of our instruction is learning how to use Desmos, learning some of these back solving tricks and techniques. But it's a very powerful tool. All right, here's a big one. My student class of 26 started taking the ST early and scored 1200. Then his score dropped on March. Right, March was hard. After following your advice, take the harder module. He improved his score to 1290 in May. Good. He's now practicing getting 1400 on practice tests, working to improve his scores further. He's planning to try the new ACT. How many more times do you recommend he take the digital SAT during his junior and senior years? Well, again, we still don't know much about availability of this digital ACT. And so, they're going to eventually release practice and, but we don't know if it'll be widely available, a small rollout. So there's no guarantee in New York. I hope it'll be widely available. But taking it, so we had a 1200, March went down, and then now you're at 1290 in May. So I would take it, if you're getting a 1400 on the practice test, I think taking it 1 or 2 more times is okay. Because, especially at schools, if you're looking at top schools, 1290 is still a bit sub, but 1400 gets you into a much stronger place, the top 2 percentile or so for the country, which is a better place to be. So I would say take it probably a couple more times. Will we be able to copy of the slides? Typically what we send is the a copy of the recording, not the slides. Should I still study for paper ACT for the science section as a rising junior? I would say yes. And we still don't know, or our colleague is going to say we still like science. Are they going to say we don't care about science? We don't know how it's going to play out yet. This thing happened on Monday. And paper, there's not going to be a real big difference in terms of the content, just the format and timing. So practicing with the paper, I think, is a smart way to do it. I would definitely still do it myself. With the changes, are there to the ACT, are there new general guidelines regarding which test is better? No, but honestly, I don't know anybody who would take a longer ACT if I can do a shorter one with more time per question, because speed has always been the challenging thing on ACT. But the question is, does science matter or not? We'll see what schools say. But I would say take a practice digital SAT, take a practice ACT, and until they offer a practice digital ACT, I wouldn't worry about this new shorter one until it's released later in the year. Does it matter to colleges if the students take the digital SAT multiple times? No. Colleges, it doesn't matter if I take it 1 time or 8 times. The question is, do you have a score to make their profile and make them look good? So they don't care how many times, but we see a point of diminishing returns after about 4, after 3, essentially. Will all of the questions still count for equal value on the paper test, or will the values vary the same as the digital test? Well, so the ACT is not yet adaptive. So on the digital SAT, it's adaptive as item response theory, item response weighting. So different items matter differently. On the ACT, everything is 1 raw point, and so it's all the same weight. So that's one distinction. Variable weighting on the SAT, equal weighting on the ACT. And it's not going adaptive until it tells us otherwise. Right now, it's a non-adaptive digital test. Can we still use the old paper SAT test material to prep for the digital SAT? Sure, you can. No question you can. And, it's a lot of the concepts are the same. And so it's, but I for sure would practice on the new format. But I did that for years. Like there were times like the GMAT changed. I still use some of the old content that I had. And it still helps you get ready. But for sure, make sure you're doing your timing and your practice tests on the new format for timing. But for just doing homework, yeah, you can practice commas and practice, algebra equations on the old content for sure. Still the same material. Is it typical for students to take both the SAT and ACT, or should they predetermine which ones they like better in practice tests? You don't need both. You definitely don't need both. And I think it's more efficient for kids to pick one, and then choose, do practice tests and do the one that you're better on and go with that one. Because you don't get extra points. Once you've checked the box for testing for a school, you don't get extra points for doing more testing, if that makes sense. So if I get a 1380 on the SC, then I also give them a 32. Like it's not more points. The question is, are you a decent enough tester? Do you have the chops to handle the work? If so, next thing, and look at your essay or everything else. Not more testing, great. Which version of the AC does not include science, the paper or the online? Well, the paper has the science baked in, the 4 sections. They're saying come the spring, come April, potentially, that you're going to have the option of taking science or not on the digital. And eventually it might port it over to the paper. But right now, and this, honestly, the digital and paper are almost identical. It's not adaptive, same timing, same number of questions. And so right now, one will be science optional, one science required. But we're gonna learn a lot more in the coming months about this likely April shorter ACT. But there will be some kids taking the long form and some on the short form. Do you pick if you want paper or online? There are many test centers in the country around the US where you choose, but there's still a lot where it's only paper. Because right now, the schools have to offer their computer labs, and not all schools are doing that. And so they're trying to encourage more of that, but I think it'll make it a lot easier if they did let you bring your own device. But right now, you have to look at your school and see, or look at the test center and see, do they offer digital testing? Otherwise, it's paper. But they should make it BYOD, bring your own device, because then that solves that problem. They need to maintain the wireless network, and then that should be it. Okay. We have time for a couple more questions if you want. Anything I didn't answer? And I promise you there'll be more coming, as we just got this press release on Monday. As we learn more, as we get more practice materials, we will share with you. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter. We had one go out yesterday, some of the content. Are you planning to offer workshops for the new ST? Absolutely. Once we get the materials, once we get firm dates, we're going to begin teaching that to our students. We'll probably for a time offer both the old school form and the new form, but I think over time it'll all migrate eventually to the new form. Yeah. Okay. If a student takes either test multiple times, they can choose their best out of attempts to submit. I think so. You get to choose which one you send and score choice. That's right. Okay. All right. Well, I think y'all, that is it for the night for the questions. Thanks so much for being part of this. Oh, there was one more question. Would colleges hold test scores and grades in equal regard? There's one more important. Typically, for most schools, it's your grades and rigor count more. Testing is subordinate. But so some of these top schools do want to have testing in there. But yeah, if your grades and rigor are weak, you can have a great testing, but then you're not really a worker. So they want to make sure you're not going to fail out of school. So they're having good grades and a strong rigor is first in hierarchy. So everybody, have a good night. We'll send you a copy soon. My pleasure. And again, there's a lot more coming on this new ACT. We hope to be a good resource for you all with that. But as we learn more, we promise we'll broadcast to you, we'll give webinars, and eventually we'll teach your kids. All right, y'all. Have a good night. Thanks.